Welcome to the swamp, everybody. Tonight's Terrestrial University will be a field trip into the wet and smelly wonders of the incredible landscape that is the swamp. Why the swamp, you ask? Well, we are joined by some of the most poetic thinkers of this uncanny territory tonight, and I will gladly let them elaborate on this. Our guides through the swampian imaginaries are the fabulous Gediminas and Nomeda Urbonas, as well as Christopher Sabolius, all three of them editors of the book Swamps and the New Imagination on the Future of Cohabitation in Art, Architecture, and Philosophy. This book is to be published in autumn. So Nomeda, Gediminas, Christophas, welcome. I will introduce you in just 1 second, but I already want to say a huge thank you for being with us tonight, because it's really you who curated this evening and invited so many wonderful people. And I know that you wanted to invite so many more, but we didn't know how to, fit everybody into one Zoom window. So yeah, thank you anyway so much. And also big congratulations for this amazing book that you will present tonight. It's really a privilege to host this book presentation, and I really can't wait to learn more about it. And yeah, to all of you at home who might not know the game yet, you are very welcome to join our Critical Zones Telegram group. That is where we all share our thoughts and questions to the panelists. And together with my dear colleague Ada and later on Nikola Bojic, we will do our best to collect your comments and questions during the live stream and pass them on to our guests. And if you want to know how to join our Telegram group, there should be a link somewhere below us, and you can also find a quick explanation on our website. All right, and so with this, it's my pleasure to formally introduce our three swamp guides, the editors of Swamps and the New Imagination. Nomeda and Gediminas, the two of you are artists, educators, and researchers at the MIT. And besides having co-founded the MIT Climate Visions Lab, you curated the Swamp School at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and you also brought the swamp to the ZKM here in Karlsruhe as part of the Critical Zones exhibition. So thanks also for that, and welcome again. Christophas, you are an associate professor of philosophy at the Vilnius University and the author of numerous books and essays that focus on the contradictory function of imagination. You were part of the Swamp School curatorial team, and you are a research affiliate at the MIT Climate Visions Lab. And you also write novels and scripts, including The Gambler, which was Lithuania's nomination for the foreign language category at the 2015 Oscars. And it was co-written with director Ignas Joninas. And I was really excited to announce that, because that made everything feel like, the Oscar glamorous part. So yeah, welcome. And please take us away into the morass and tell us about Swamps and the New Imagination and how, you've come to fall in love with this fascinating landscape. Yeah, maybe Nomeda, Gediminas, you go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for your lovely introduction and amazing energy. And thank you, everyone at the ZKM, for an effort you invested in this event.
Hi to everyone here at the Swamp Lounge, and to those in the diverse worlds beyond, watching us from the forests, hills, oceans, deserts, or meadows. I have to admit, we are intentionally imprecise using the term swamp. Wetlands can have many names: quagmires, marshes, bogs, or fens. However, the term swamp stands out for its irritant subject. Long malign, abused by political rhetoric, drained and extracted for the sake of progress, swamps represent arguably the most uncanny place on Earth and in the cosmology of modern man. On the way to Inferno, one needs to suffer the swampy, stinking waters of the river Styx and the black goo of the Stygian swamp, in which one can find no joy in God. In either hell or the underworld of chthonic powers, it is a miry swamp, not a gentle and soothing fen or bog. The term swamp itself suggests submersion with its connotations of overwhelming muck, of waters closing overhead. This dark place, shapeless and limitless as the universe itself, is an abyss into which we steer. The swamp mirrors the depth of our own imagination, illuminating with a ghostly spark like an Ignus Fatum or Will of the Wisp.
However uncanny the swamp is, it is yet stuck in the habits of political rhetoric that call for mobilization against anomaly and deviation, as seen in the retrained refrain of Drain the Swamp. Renare la palude, as we know it from Garibaldi and Mussolini, as they actively transformed the Italian landscape. Draining, cleansing, and purifying of swamps, getting rid of things deemed queer or witchy, was not only embedded in the project of fascism, but in the rhetoric of modernity as well.
The Cartesian plane of the Enlightenment, which set a tone in scientific classification, was filtered through the idea of producing only useful knowledge that is in service of European civilization, separating and discarding all that is muddy, queer, or obscure. Swamps could not fit into that purified classification as they are hybrid and indigenous, a matter that has not yet been tamed and resisted taming, that dirty, murky, slothy terrain that is neither water nor land.
Unless drained, swamps do not lend themselves to extraction. Huge repositories of peat, the organic compound that is similar to coal, are hidden under the water. Growing extremely slowly, sphagnum moss turns into peat, arguably the best carbon sink on the planet Earth.
However, the value of swamps cannot be reduced just to bioservice. Their measure cannot be limited to economic terms only. The swamp's relationship to human settlements is complex. The very project of urbanization swamps to the margins of humanity and humans to the margins of swamps produces a recursivity of swampification and cyclic contingency of extraction and expulsion.
The dual ontology of the swamp is the crux of this book, bringing the swamp into the center of visionary artistic cybernetic experimentation, once started by Gordon Pask and Stafford Beers. The insights bring to our attention the interactions of life forms and the model of balance that could inspire management of complex processes in human society. The cybernetic imaginary of the swamp suggests hybrid interfaces and forms of intelligence, which work to orient us towards landing on Earth, not leaving the Earth.
Going deeper into the subject of swamps, it becomes apparent that we are dealing with much more than a metaphor signifying an organized mud. It unfolds as well-organized biosphere and as a library of diverse artistic, cultural, historic, and cybernetic knowledge. As editors of this volume, we argue that a swamp is a multifaceted lens through which we can view connections and interdependencies, not only between the life forms and non-living matter, where we can discover the complexity of our symbiotic planet, as insightfully described by the biologist Lynn Margulis, but in the assemblage of eclectic sources that are in service of a speculative poetic ontology that sketches possible implications for thinking and acting in the present, as in words of Stuart McLean.
The technique that swamps offers is an active engagement with the material world, in the words of Ursula Le Guin. Hence, is the chancy, formless, fluctuating, unreliable, and in the end, unknowable matter that shifts between the modalities from solid to liquid, from liquid to vapor, becoming the focus of our attention.
Hello, and I'm stepping in here and talking about imagination. So Swamp has a history of imagination that represents the place outside the space of culture and civilization. The discomforting topography of wetlands links the problematic identity of being neither water nor land with an anxiety related to its uncanny nature, infested with malaria, miasma, and melancholia. Rod Giblett even traces down the feminist locus of wetlands. As the nemesis of the knowable patriarchy, wetlands appeared hideous and ghastly, unclassifiable, treated as feminine and mysterious as the womb itself. This is also the reason why, in the Western cultural imaginary, wetlands used to be conceived of primarily as dystopian places. One could say that swamp marks a crisis of modern imagination and a reimagining of which we are in dire need in order to begin reorienting the dynamic between space and time. The famous polemics on the Anthropocene and its alternative titles, among other things, expresses our failures of representation. That is, our incapacity to conceive of geological temporality on a human scale. In fact, as witnessed by the thinkers of imagination, from Kant to Sartre to Bachelard and Simondon, the perception of place is deeply rooted in the techniques of imagination, which exercise the translation from time to space. Imagination morphs these moments of juncture and produces a schematics of orientation, which may critically channel a new dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. Hence, we would like to conceive of the swamp as a locus of imagination, the place of codependencies and correlations, which have frequently been overlooked. It is also in line with Bruno Latour's proposal of critical zones, which expands our imagination of space by including not only horizontal, geopolitical, geographical, but also the vertical, geological, and cosmological access into the concept of environment. Or perhaps we should even make a stronger claim that the new imagining of the swamp is also an attempt to grasp and express those manifold symbiotic relations that have been left invisible so far. Swamp can teach us a lot about entangled existence. In this sense, swamp may also provide an interface of Gaia, that is, offer a face, a certain physiognomy to evoke faceless networks of relations, inviting us to understand and to cultivate the regimes of entanglement that engender novel models of socio-biological coexistence with other than humans.
Swamps are slow ecosystems, and thus the swamp book is a slow process, weaving practices and approaches around the subject of swamp in an effort to unfold the paradox of dialectical tension between the book as the process of thinking and as tangible material, a printed object.
The Swamp book intends to initiate discursive space, envisioning the role of sympoiesis in an age that calls for non-human turn and for interspecies dialogue. The book is offered as a reader for many audiences invested in the question of cohabitation in art, architecture, and philosophy. From the interdisciplinary to non-disciplinary ability to engage massive worlds of mud and other ways of knowing, the book is an attempt to register a perpetual process of swamping as probed in the project.
Building from the network of institutions behind the Swamp School, launched at the Venice Biennale and Architecture Biennale in 2018, and initial ideas drafted in the series of Swamp School manuals, this publication pulls together scholars on intersectional topics, including transnational and speculative architecture, feminist and queer theory, posthumanism, ecology, materialism, visual studies, and imagination, cybernetics, sociology, and the commons, to argue for conviviality, living together, and symbiosis, making together, in imagining the future.
For a pedagogical exercise that engages sensorial, immersive, embodied knowing, these projects imagine a future learning environment to support emerging forms of amphibian pedagogy and urge us towards a change of perspective.
The value of swamps as ecotones and as transitory ecosystem is acknowledged in the essays and reflected in the layout as well. A swamp cannot be contained, always leaking through the disciplinary boundaries, smuggling and contaminating knowledge and disciplines. Thus, there is the swamp book, where no rigid boundaries or so-called chapters. The text flows one into the other. The book can be read from anywhere, although one perhaps should follow the meandering lines and notions that ripple from one author into the next.
As the ecotone negotiates between material modalities, the design concept of the book, elaborated with Node Berlin Oslo, is based on the refrain which repeats throughout many of the essays. A swamp, being neither land nor water, but anything in between, requires an exercise of diplomatic translations between perspectives. The two colors of the layer, brown and blue, merging one into other through the so-called iris spring process, are saturated with endless possibilities of shades and gradients in between. The morphing iris printing process eliminates the possibility of strict human control, letting the chimeric mixes of colors happen by chance.
Mentioning just a few names would not do justice for the swamp. So we are grateful to all the writers, scholars, and artists who contributed to this endeavor.
Lorena Bello and Brent Ryan, Nicola Boych and Chiara Bottici, Tega Brain and Jonathan Chrisman, Newton Harrison, Gloria Davenport and Gershon Dublon, TJ Dimos, Vittoria Di Palma, Jennifer Gabriz, Tina Gretarsdottir, Sigurður Baldur Hafsteinsson, Stefan Hemreich, Stephanie Hessler, Monica Hutton, Ingela Irman, Caroline Malmström,
Giedrė Jankevičiūtė, Caroline Jones, Lars Banglarshan, Bruno Latour, Astrida Neimanis, Kate Orff, Marielle Villery, Andrew Pickering, Cristina Lipodesva, Elizabeth Povinelli, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, Dimitris Papadopoulos, Thomas Pauch, Kristina Recupero, Eglė Rindzevičiūtė, Kristupas Abolius, Saskia Sassen, Katarina Skaramelli, Marcos Cotini, Sandra Skurvita, Helen Tan, Indrė Umbrasaitė, Angela Vitesse.
The book would not be possible without your intelligence, perseverance, and patience. Thank you. Thanks to our publisher Sternberg Press and MIT Press, the distributor. Thanks to all the institutions backing the Swamp School for their support, Lithuanian Council for Culture and Architecturos Fondas, Council for the Arts at MIT, John and Cynthia Reed Foundation, UAF University of Venice, and Kesko Veneto, Baltoprint, and Skubas Suntos. We also want to thank our editorial consultants, Marielle Villery, Jonathan Chrisman, Monica Hutton, our proofreader, Caroline Scher, and our team at MIT Climate Visions for the incredible work they have done. Thank you all. Now it is our pleasure to introduce our guest artist, John Jonas. Thank you, John, for joining us. John Jonas is a pioneer of video and performance art and an acclaimed multimedia artist. Among numerous exhibitions, screening, and performances worldwide, she's been featuring in Documenta 6 times and represented United States at the Venice Biennale. Jonas is a professor emerita at the MIT program in Art Culture and Technology, and was the 2018 recipient of the Kyoto Prize for Arts and Philosophy. John will read the sympoetic essay assembled from the voices of all contributors writing to the Swamp book. Our ears and eyes are yours, John.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? You can, all right. Swamps and the new imagination. What happens when the swamp, a space where solid, clear-cut boundaries collapse in the fluidity of exchanges, where the earth meets and greets the water, where the water welcomes and merges with the earth, a space inhabited by species that question all established boundaries, is brought back into our political thinking. While it is impossible for people to grasp what it is to take up responsibility for the stewardship of the whole planet, it is much easier to see where one stands in relation to a critical zone of variable dimensions. Can the swamp provide a critical zoning of our imagination? By relying on its transformative spatio-temporality, we need to find a way to take a step back from the anthropocentric limelight and identify ourselves as environmentally expedient, as an inherent part of a milieu. In a way, the swamp reflects humankind's ambiguous attitudes toward nature itself. On the one hand, it is the origin of life, the very birthplace of humanity. On the other, all myths and legends link it to the underworld and death. The concept of swamp is inseparable from biological life, as it is essential to the survival of many species, even those that live outside it. Poets and artists competed in rewriting the mythology of thriving and idyllic coasts, evoking a magical sea monsters and the beauty of sea flora and fauna shimmering under the waves. I am quite a collector of these strange lamentations. Although not a charismatic chimera like a sphinx or the hydra, a swamp is also a Mischwesen, to use the delightful German term, a mixed being, which in the case of the swamp is at the same time a conserving and transformational mass of vibrant stuff. It can be seen as poiesis materialized, to use the ancient Greek word for a process that brings something into being that did not exist before. It is no coincidence that both the swamp and the desert, in order to be anthropocized areas, impose the need, despite their opposing confirmations, for recourse to ancient social and collective cognitive reserves, and as adaptation and self-determination, an appeal to autonomous powers, the avoidance of external agents. Although other kinds of landscapes, such as mountains, forests, and commons, were routinely included in the category of wasteland, swamps were in many ways archetypal. In fact, the history of the fens of Eastern England is patterned on a pervasive narrative according to which a desolate, marginal, and unproductive region is redeemed through the civilizing forces of technology, private property, and agricultural development. Geological features have often been refuge for freedom. Ecologies have often sustained fugitives, runaways, and maroons. Swamps, high mountains, remote corners of infertile or inaccessible land, the vastness of the ocean, all are shelters of freedom, helping the worlding of movements. Producing challenging cover, swamps were perfect for fugitives. Particularly in the US South, swamps became places of escape and sanctuary for runaways from the American slave system, as in the 1 million acres originally forming the extent of the Great Dismal Swamp, bridging Virginia and North Carolina. The global nature of climate change, capital toxicity, and discursivity immediately demands we look elsewhere than where we are standing. We have to follow the flows of the toxic industries whose byproducts seep into foods, forests, and aquifers, and visit the viral transit lounges that join species through disease vectors. As we stretch the local across these accepting transits, we need not scale up the human or the global, but we cannot remain in the local. We can only remain here-ish. The network of global cities functions as a new geography of centrality that cuts across the old north-south, east-west divides. And so does the network of processing zones for outsourced labor. One geology concentrates on global wealth, the other on global cheap labor. The swamp is the nemesis of modern governmental rationality, rationality based on the notions of classical mechanics. It is not difficult to understand why the communists, Mussolini, Putin, and Trump have turned to the swamp to campaign against something they do not understand, but wish to be away. The swamp is antithetical to the linear, mechanistic mind. They have projected their utopias onto a site that has become a symbol of binaries, such as nature, artifice, land, water, isolation, exploration, condemnation, salvation, and above all, surveillance, tolerance. What are swamps? They are places that anchor ways of thinking about material and political transformations in and of time and space. Swamps have come to exist in their rhetorical and material effects as theories, mobile systems of ideas for a drifting and muddled world. While we may argue that our brains are indeed deeply woven into technological networks, conundrums like war or ecological crises are far from resolved. When a connection is lost, the mind immediately gets to work mending the gap, repairing, reconstructing connectivity without so much attachment to anything, without a stable grounding, metaphorically as well as structurally, as if in a swamp or quicksand. Does the unthinkable precede the entangled matters of infrastructures in, under conflict zones of territories? Swamps, like atmospheres, are earth engines. They churn and cycle nutrients and pollutants, and they form through interactions with vegetation and weather, minerals, and organisms. What form of life might a wet model of knowledge follow? Why not a flowing romp of otters, or the movement of swarms? Why not the murmurations of starlings? When it is best to put this model into practice, and how? The emerging language informed by the sensations of place and interdependencies we encounter in swamps may lead us to an amphibian pedagogy as a way to leak beyond the disciplinary boundaries toward other ways of knowing. When beholding the marshes, where everything is relentlessly submerged, broken down, and digested, we witness with Tournier and Kochia that any ecosystem is by nature post-apocalyptic and is built upon the ruins of prior ecosystems. If we were to survive the Anthropocene, I agree, this is the kind of research that is desperately needed in terms of important, even imperative challenge of how to move beyond Anthropocenism, racism. What happens, for instance, if following the fluidity of the exchanges between wetland and earthly waters, between amphibian and aerial creatures, we start thinking of that trans space that lies between different individualities, as well as between all the different domains of life? Not solid or liquid, but transition in between is where the amphibian skill navigates, crafting its learning environment with respect to its morphing, hybridity, acts of poiesis, queerness, and a paradox of perspectivism. Living in a turf house is about living with the swamp, from the intimacy of living with soil composed of roots, minerals, waters, and gases, to coming into relation with the swamp as a living, multi-species world of producers, consumers, mutualists, symbiotic partners, decomposers, and so on. As the house is built, the turf removed from a centuries-old swamp containing water, microbes, invertebrates, and rhizomes wants to dry and transform. A new composition of organisms emerge as the wetland body slowly decomposes. Put in other words, how can the bifurcation of the single historical timeline support the growth of multiple decentralized and self-managed futures where different social groups and species can merge into the new forms of environmental homeostasis? Wetlands would be a good setting for ecosexual commons. All that squishy mud and panting vegetation sucking in your armpits and up your nostrils. When I wear the mantle, my body becomes the soft interior of the clam. The built-in bathtub is my tiled bathroom because becomes the two halves of the shell, and the walls and the floor of my apartment become the coral reef onto which the clams are often attached when they are small. The warm water from the faucet, which rises and sinks as I fill up and let out the bathing water, is the tidal water that comes and goes. My own version of the swamp has been the coastal salt marsh, the wetland, the edge of the city that has been characteristically filled, straightened, flattened, eradicated, and been the site of the garbage dump. And so that marble melts and shrinks, and that blue grows and rises. Those in the north and south, unable to move from the coast or displaced to new swamplands, will have to hybridize. They will need to become an amphibian society that resolves the anthropogenic processes through swampification. I think that's it. Thank you for asking me.
I don't know what enchantment we could dream of better than you, John, with your voice reading from the heart of the swamp. Thank you. Yeah, and please join me in thanking John. Now I am very pleased to introduce the contributors to the book joining us at the Swamp Studio. Vittoria De Palma, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, Dimitris Papadopoulos, Jennifer Gabris, and Astrida Neimanis, who will unpack the emergent worlds discussed in the essays. Please find more information about the impressive publication and works of our speakers and respondents at ZKM website. Following their provocations, we invite you, the audience, watching us live, to join the Q&A session. Let me briefly introduce our first speaker. Vittoria De Palma is architectural historian and associate professor at the University of Southern California. She is a co-editor of Intimate Metropolis, Urban Subjects in the Modern City, and the author of the prize-winning Wastelands, A History monograph from Yale University Press. Her current book project focuses on climate, aesthetics, and disease in the early modern period. Her contribution, Swampland Elegy, marks the first-hand experience of Carl Albert Weber, German botanist. Please join me in welcoming Vittoria.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So I'd like to begin by thanking Gediminas and Nomeda and Christoupas for inviting me to contribute a chapter to their forthcoming book, Swamps and the New Imagination, and for including me in the event today. I'm here in the role of architectural and landscape historian. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the subject I would like to address in my brief time today is the relationship of swamps to history, or to be more precise, the relationship of one particular swamp to history. The swamp in question is the Aukštumala raised peat bog of Western Lithuania. The time is late July 1898. The The author is the Prussian botanist Karl Albert Weber. And the groundbreaking book that Weber publishes in 1902 is entitled Über die Vegetation und Entstehung des Hochmoors von Augstumal in Memel-Delta, or in English, on the vegetation and emergence of the Augstumala raised peat bog in what is now known as the Nemunas Delta. Weber's book is groundbreaking in a number of ways. It is the first book to address swamps in a rigorously scientific way, in the modern data-driven sense of scientific. And in doing so, it formulated the modern definition of a raised peat bog, which has 4 different characteristics. A raised peat bog has a mounded convex profile. Its waters have an acidic pH. Its plants were dependent on precipitation for their water and nutrients, and its vegetation was dominated by sphagnum mosses. This definition was to prove immensely important for subsequent scientific studies of swamps. But Weber's book was also the first to understand a swamp in historical terms. Now, this does not mean that Weber's book was the first to include a discussion of swamps that existed in the past. So the Roman Pontine marshes, of course, were well known from classical literature, mentioned by Livy, by Strabo, by Pliny the Elder, by Plutarch, among others, and had also been included in earlier books on swamps, such as William Dugdale's The History of Embanking and Draining of Diverse Fens and Marshes, which was published in 1662. Rather, what I am saying is that Weber's book was the first to understand a swamp as a historical entity, one that existed not only in space, but also in time. In other words, Weber saw the Augstumala bog as a living thing that came into being, that grew, that changed through time. His book presents what we could call a biography of the Augstumala peat bog, one that stretches from the swamp's earliest beginnings in deepest prehistory to Weber's own moment at the end of the 19th century. For Weber, that swamp was alive. In order to convey this historical understanding, Weber needed to represent his swamp in new ways. In the European tradition, swamps start to enter into visibility in the early modern period. In the 17th century, we find maps of swamps that attempt to fix their variable and undulating perimeters. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we start to see increasing numbers of paintings that represent swamps' thick atmospheres or their low horizons and vast expanses of sky. Weber continued these representational traditions by including maps and photographs of the Augstumala swamp, but he also introduced something new. He produced sections. Weber includes sections of the bog's undulating landscapes of hummocks and pine trees. He displays cross sections of individual heath hummocks to illustrate growth over time, and he carefully draws the entire extent from root to tip of a 12-year-old specimen of deer sedge, labeled with dates to indicate annual growth. For Weber, the deer sedge serves as a timeline in miniature, providing a means of gauging the growth of the peatland surface over the previous decade. Constructing this kind of vertical analysis enabled Weber to place the peat bog within a longer history of climate change and adaptation. Weber's book demonstrated the importance of the vertical dimension to understanding the life of a swamp. For him, the section was key to conveying the swamp's growth and change over time, its Entstehung or emergence. By focusing on the vertical dimension of the Augstumala raised peat bog, Weber was able to journey back along the lifespan of the swamp, merging with it in a deep time imaginary. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for introducing us to your essay and also shining light on the Swamp Bible. That is indeed the first scholarship on the swamps, and also addressing the vertical dimension. After working with Victoria and Karl Albert Weber in Augstumala swamp, we returned to ask our second speakers and the caretakers of the soil and the terra, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa and Dimitris Papadopoulos. Maria Puig de la Bella Casa is associate professor at the University of Warwick, where she works at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies. She is author of Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in Modern Human Worlds from Minnesota University Press, a book that initiates conversation between feminist critical thinking on care and debates on modern human ontologies in science and technology studies, the environmental humanities, and social theory. Dimitris Papadopoulos is Professor of Science, Technology, and Society and Director of Institute for Science and Society at University of Nottingham. Dimitris is author of Reactivating Elements, Chemistry, Ecology, Practice from Duke University Press, and Experimental Practice, Technoscience, Alternontologies, and Modern Social Movements. Maria and Dimitris will discuss their contribution, eco-commoning in aftermath, sand use, mangroves, and swamp insurgencies. Please.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this project and of this event. It's truly wonderful, and we are grateful for this invitation. As you said, our contribution to the discussion and to this volume is on commons and eco-commoning, so ecological commoning. And with commons, we understand spaces, things, ideas, everything that is not enclosed in state governance or in private production. Everything that is self-managed by those who participate in it, and spaces, things, ideas sustained by smaller or larger local or translocal or virtual groups of practitioners and caretakers. And we try to read swamp and the swamps through commoning. And of course, as we were doing that, this exercise reversed and we started thinking commons and commoning through the swamp. So from 1680, for example, the Great Dismal Swamp, located on the border of Virginia and North Carolina in the US, in the United States of America, was a refuge for escaped slaves and the habitat of hidden communities of fugitives, similar to countless other maroon communities throughout South and North America and other parts of the world. Their settlements and ways of life had to evolve together with the swamp to become entangled with the fate of the swamp's ecology, its impenetrable sub-canopy vegetation and thick muddy wetlands, but also with the later attempts to drain and exploit parts of the swamp. They had to move constantly from one space to the next, rearrange their connections with the swamp, with the ecologies, with the plants and the animals, how to hide, how to escape, how to create global and local connections with other communities far away in other parts of the swamp or outside the Great Dismal Swamp itself. The commons of the swamp was a refuge of freedom. But swamp commoning is not just about freedom. That's for us one of the ways we try to understand the swamp. It became later, the swamp became later for us also a model of how place and commons fuse into each other. The commons rarely exist in the abstract and never outside the specific ecology. But this ecological embeddedness is not static, is not just given, is not one thing that happens for once. It's a process of co-emergence, and often is also a process of disconnection. But the commoners and the commons, the land, the plants and the animals, the concrete geologies, the stones, the rocks, the soil, the mountains, the hills, and the common rights, the local common rights, the way we associate as commoners together construct each other. And when they disappear, they often disappear in tandem. Past and current radical struggles of commoners, radical struggles of commoning, are not only histories about common rights, they are also more than human histories of self-organized ecological cohabitation. So the freedom of the swamp, the political dimension of the swamp itself, becomes a model, becomes a way of commoning that comes to find us today in a moment where we face ecological degradation. Eco-commoning for us, ecological commoning, is a situated response and engagement because our social and political institutions can't confront, and we need possibly to add, they don't want to confront what is happening environmentally at local and planetary levels as a single general problem to be solved at once. Eco-commoning is an answer to that, but it's a situated answer and it's a practical answer.
So now these histories of more than human swamp insurgencies and survival that Dimitris just mentioned speak of a dimension of hope and suffering where insurgency and survival go hand in hand. So reading the stories as eco-commoning today also amplify awareness for the distress of the non-humans that become entangled with socio-technical practices. Eco-commoning is another way to acknowledge how non-humans are involved in a constant process of sharing matter, sharing their bodies with each other and with us. Western ontologies, economies rarely acknowledge the ways in which humans partake from these processes, as they stay with an anthropocentric conception that reduces the sharing of matter to resources or more recently to services. Eco-commoning is a way of naming practices that resonate well with emerging engagements that we encountered in our work that envision the soil we live from and with as a more than human ecology of which we are part. So thinking with the proposition of the swamp, we also thought with practices such as permaculture that in our work we have looked at, and people stopping considering themselves as consumers in a web of life, of a web of life living in the soil, but as part of that web of life. So seeing the soil as a common, not something that is out there, but as a resource for human communities that they would manage well, we look at it at something as a world we are in material relationships with, a world of eco-commoning. And one specific vision of soil life that we approach in our reflections with the swamp is one that has been mobilized within these practices to transform our relations with soils. And it's an understanding of the ecology of soil as a food web. So these, briefly, the food web models of ecological life describe the incredibly complex interactions between species that circulate nutrients and energy, conceptualized as soil communities based on trophic relationships, who eats who, and how the energy circulates afterwards. We eat and circulate again this energy. The food web models emphasize a living interdependent world, teeming with life, but always fragile. So from this perspective, soil is a common. It is commoning because it's generated in these relations. It is these relations because what we see as soil is a collaborative effort in breaking down matter in a common, in this practice of commoning matter, making it available for a range of beings for existing. For instance, the nutrients that feed the plants, again, after waste is broken down by bacteria and recirculates as energy and food for other creatures. But this is also true for chemical compounds, such as nitrogen, which is an essential nutrient made available for plants by bacteria. And considering the food web as that which makes us involves taking care of these creatures by avoiding putting in the soils excess of manufactured substances that we produce for enhancing productivity of the soil, such as manufactured nitrogen, fertilizers, and pesticides that progressively destroy life in the soil. So for us, thinking relations with non-humans, eco-commoning also amplifies this awareness of the distress of non-humans today that are entangled with these practices. And this is also true for wetlands, swamps, peatlands, and bogs. So we think eco-commoning today also as part of what's happening, our obligations as part of the derangement of these planetary cycles. And one of the issues affecting wetlands is how this excess of nutrients comes to places in which actually are naturally poor in nutrients. by coming with this excess of manufactured substances and creating an excess of nutrients in these environments, then we are actually damaging these creatures in these environments, which usually don't require so many nutrients to live. Now, so that's just an example of how eco-commoning obliges us to transform the ways we live in the everyday with the web of life in alliance with these non-human creatures that make our living possible. And not just by using non-humans to clean the toxic waste and byproducts that we put in the soil. So for us, the swamp and all these stories of swamp insurgency allow us to speculatively also engage with what are the ways of remediation that we can collectively put in place to repair the damage. And it's in this impure imaginary that eco-commoning comes to be transformative and having this insurgent power in the context of the swamp.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Dimitris, for sharing with us your reparative vision of the eco-commoning and the swamp as a mobilizing idea, as you describe it, for survival and sustaining web of life. Now, I will ask our third speaker, Jennifer Gabrice, to get closer to the edge of this quagmire window. Jennifer, in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge and an honorary visiting professor in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. Among other books, she is author of Program Earth, Environmental Sensing Technology and the Making of Computational Planet. Jennifer contributed to the Swamp book with her essay Phytosensor Toolkit, Cultivating the Swamps of Urban Air. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gediminas, Nomada, and Christopus, as well as the ZKM for this invitation to speak to the topic of swamps. I'm just going to share my screen as well. So what's nice also about Joan reading from the text is I did notice the first line from my presentation is in the text as well in Joan's presentation. Swamps, like atmospheres, are earth engines. They churn and cycle nutrients and pollutants, and they form through interactions with vegetation and weather, minerals and organisms, methane and carbon. Projects of cultivating swamps are also projects of cultivating atmospheres. At one time, swamps were seen to give rise to unbreathable miasmas that could produce disease, infirmity, and even death. Now urban airs are awash with ozone, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds, which combine into heady, if swampy mixtures that contribute to millions of air pollution-related deaths worldwide every year. Air pollution is most often the result of burning fossil fuels, whether for powering vehicles or heating buildings. One could then say that the swamp has been displaced to the atmosphere, since fossil fuels are composed of decomposed plant matter, primarily moss, that once proliferated in swamps. This swampy vegetal matter has been compressed over hundreds of millions of years into carbon, often in the form of coal, but also oil and gas, which is subsequently burned to power cities, and in the process make a swamp of urban airs. The atmosphere becomes a heavenly swamp, a vaulted site of currents and equally indeterminate if airborne formations. During the colonial expansion across North America in the 19th century, government manuals for draining swamps were circulated as guides to reclaim land. Yet other modes of swamp work might also be possible that involve more reciprocal and less extractive relations with swampy environments. One updated swamp manual that might aid such a practice is a guide developed through the Citizen Sense research project, the Phytosensor Toolkit. Plants are organisms that are continually sensing and changing our environments. Plants detect and take up the residue of combusted ancient plant matter by trapping and absorbing pollutants and purifying the air. Phytosensor is a term that I use to describe these vegetal processes whereby plants sense and respond to their environments. The Phytosensor Toolkit is a citizen sensing project that collaboratively studies plant life in the field, contributes to air quality gardens for mitigating air pollution, which you can see here, and generates a toolkit for the ongoing creation of air quality gardens. The Phytosensor Toolkit began through a demonstration garden that included air quality sensitive and mitigating plants. This garden was developed through the Museum of London, working with a landscape architecture firm. The air quality plants that Citizen Sense specified for the garden became the basis for the Phytosensor Toolkit, which provided a resource for people to learn about air quality plants, develop their own gardens, and attempt to mitigate the swamp of urban air pollution. The development of the toolkit took place through a workshop and walk in the square mile of the City of London. It drew on input from event participants and began to cultivate urban atmospheres. The Phytosensor Toolkit is a resource and guide for learning more about plants that respond to and mitigate pollution. As a pedagogic toolkit, it introduces participants to a different array of plants and trees that could be planted as green screens to channel particulates, sown in drifts and roadsides to absorb vehicle-related emissions, or grown in vegetal communities to facilitate the uptake of air and soil-based pollutants. The toolkit focuses on the way in which phytosensing could detoxify and bioremediate air quality, especially in urban settings. Resources are included in the toolkit to aid in the further development of clean air gardens. Included in the kit is a map and walking route for visiting clean air gardens installed in the City of London, which demonstrate resident initiatives for growing plants to improve air quality. The process of planting vegetation to rework the atmospheric swamps might then be approached as an updated manual for swamp work. Such a toolkit method facilitates new modes of plant-based carbon work by moving from reclamation to bioremediation in the form of particulate capture, pollutant transformation, atmospheric filtration, and more than human collaboration. As a toolkit for reworking the swamps of urban atmospheres, the Phytosensor Toolkit tunes in to expanded processes of environmental sensing and transformation that occur across multiple entities. A different manual for swamp work materializes here, less as a set of instructions that would drain swamps to make the land productive. Instead, this approach is more aligned with cultivation practices that stir the cosmopolitical broth of the atmospheric swamp to generate less extractive and more reciprocal environmental exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for activating the sensorial notion on the planetary scale. Last but not the least, I'd like to welcome Astrida Neimanis to the Zoom podium. Astrida Neimanis is Associate Professor of Feminist Environmental Humanities at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, on unceded Syilx territory in Kelowna, British Columbia. Post-human feminist phenomenology from Bloomsbury explores the shared watery constitution of human bodies and all other planetary life as a starting point for rethinking environmental ethics, aesthetics, and justice. Often in dialogue with artists and artworks, her work has recently been featured at the Shanghai Biennial this year, in Riga Biennial last year, and the Lofoten Biennial in 2019. Her essay, Bad Ecosex and Failed Repair in the Wetland, is featured in the Swamp book. Please join me in welcoming Astrida, and please, Astrida.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And indeed, I am zooming into you today from the unceded Syilx territories of the Okanagan Valley, which were also once a big, beautiful natural wetland prior to colonization. But in my chapter and in this brief preview, I want to introduce you to another wetland, one of my favorite places in the world. Windermere Basin is located on the tip of Hamilton Harbor in southwestern Ontario. If you get in your car and you drive from Toronto to Niagara Falls, about halfway along the journey, you'll cross the Skyway Bridge. And from this vantage point, you can see Lake Ontario stretching out from the driver's side, while Hamilton's infamous skyline opens up to your right. Across the harbor, the greenways of the Desjardins Canal are overshadowed by the lake freighters and the spectacle of the belching steel mills that take up the East End view. Windermere Basin is almost under the bridge in the southwest armpit of the lake. It's very easy to miss. If you take Eastport Drive exit though, and you pull into a small gravel parking lot, you might find me at the end of a little walking path that leads out to a concrete platform that overlooks this little basin. Perhaps the blooms of the Queen Anne's lace will be lining the platform, while just beyond them, a little rabbit will disappear into the purple loosestrife. Wind wrinkles the surface of the water, and a heavy belly of cloud hangs down from the ceiling of an otherwise blue sky. Yet it's difficult to imagine that this place was once a natural wetland and a mud flat. Not that long ago, Windermere was part of the ecotone of land and freshwater used mostly by Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people as seasonal hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds prior to and then concurrent with early settler colonization. This was followed by massive industrialization, which included major infilling of lands and the construction of the basin in 1954, soon choked by heavy industrial deposits from Canada's largest steel industry. By the 1980s, the harbor was designated an area of concern, and Windermere Basin was singled out as a particular worry. Its sediment contained an average of 19 times the PCBs of anywhere else on Lake Ontario. It was called an ugly and polluted cesspool and was deemed beyond repair. But today, here, the field is bursting with goldenrod, and a carp jumps impossibly high from the creek waters. The basin is located on a seasonal bird migration path, as a hawk's shadow moving across the scraggly weeds reminds me. And despite its contamination, Windermere is visited by numerous rare bird species. Many other plants and animals, milkweed, fish, bees, coyotes, also thrive. And this is partly why in 2002, Hamilton launched a $22 million remediation plan. And 2 decades later, Windermere Basin is one of Canada's largest inland coastal wetlands. I'm just going to share my screen. Official reports claim that the wetland has healed, but what does this mean? Despite cleanup efforts, the park remains crammed between a highway, steel mills, and a sewage plant. The freeway trucks rattle and an acrid stench hangs in the air. Even if industrial poisons are settling down, climate change is stepping up. Rising temperatures and phosphate runoff now contribute to frequent algal blooms, which keep the waters off limits to humans and companion animals. A sign repeats itself in several places. Danger, keep out of water, unsafe soft sediment at the bottom of the pond, entrapment likely, no pets allowed. Water levels fall to reveal unstable, toxic muck. This remains a place of dumped desires. During my visits, I eventually make my way down to the water's edge. And from the platform that includes a commemorative plaque and information about the rehabilitation process, you can look across to the nesting habitats of 3 artificial islands, but also down to the creek waters that snake past. Although most of the drowned industrial slag has been capped and sealed, the waters still receive overflow from the wastewater treatment plant, as well as the varied mundane detritus that makes itself down the waters of the Red Hill Creek. The overgrown and mostly inaccessible bank is thick with water bottles, shotgun shells, stir sticks, lighters, candy wrappers, coffee cup lids, styrofoam straws, Kinder Egg toy casings, and in one particular irony, a 10-centimeter green plastic turtle perched on a small flat rock. What always catches my eye, though, are the multitudes of plastic tampon applicators in all colors of the rainbow. All of these menstruating bodies turned inside out, flushed down the toilet, then further out to get stuck on the mucky bank of this inland sea. And yet, I am in a strange kind of love with this place. While in these times of colonization and climate catastrophe, our desiring bodies are necessarily implicated in these various kinds of damage, pleasure also needs to be accounted for. Bad eco-sex, I suggest, might be a helpful way to think about these tangled desires, bodies, and inheritances at Windermere. Everything here is figuring out how to get on in a permanently polluted world that is not only about fixing things, or rather is not about fixing things, but rather figuring out new ways to persist. Somehow, we all sense that persisting will be better if we can find new ways to give ourselves over to each other's half-broken presences in a kind of toxic love.
For your invigorating provocation. As I experienced land reclamation during the Soviet times, I remember people used to say there is no sex in Soviet Union, but thanks to you, I had sex perhaps.
Right. So yeah, some big thank you, Astrida, for transporting us all the way, for me, across an entire ocean, but into a wetland that I didn't know about, but I could feel and nearly smell thanks to your wonderful words. So thank you for this. And also thank you to all the other contributors. I mean, there's so much to unpack and so much that has been pickled. That I'm really, really happy that we still have plenty of time for a Q&A. So we will now open, as Gedimina said, the Swamp Lounge. And we are also joined for this last part, this Q&A, by Nikola Bojic. Hello, Nikola. You are a lecturer at the Academy of Fine Art in Zagreb and an affiliate researcher at the MIT Climate Visions Lab. And you also explore relations between environment, technology, and the future. So welcome to the Swamp Lounge and to the board. There are already some questions bubbling up on the chat. So everybody at home, if you still have questions, you're very welcome to share them on Telegram. But I will let Nikola start the Q&A and I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone, for actually inspiring and very provocative presentations. So I'm going to start with a question from Telegram and somehow diverge and broaden it a bit. So we have a question from Tiny Domingos asking, could your project help for a global wetland, mangroves, swamps, meadows, protection and reconstruction plan for the sake of biodiversity and remediation? The massive extinction of amphibians and mangrove species is ongoing on full speed without much attention. This is for sure topic that's somehow present in this ongoing research for some time. And I would like to redirect this question and broaden it up a bit specifically to Dimitris and Maria. So having this Telegram question in mind, I would like to ask you a question. So you defined eco-commoning as development of coexistence between plants, animals, and humans, by which life worlds regenerate beyond and sometimes despite extractivism, productionism, and coloniality, right? So, like you recognize this capacity to restore ecosystem. However, this extractivism and productivism and coloniality, as you mentioned, are all shaping our current planetary condition. But at the same time, they are heterogeneous phenomena, evolving locally in site-specific ecosystem and specific materialities. So, actually, I'm interested in this interspace, this speculative capacity of eco-commoning, which operates between these two scales, between planetary scale and material specific scale. Can you please elaborate more on the scales of eco-commoning and maybe tell us how swamps can potentially feed into this politically charged speculative interspace?
You want to?
No, I think you should.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. I think you mentioned scale, and you know, whenever we present this stuff, one of the questions that we get is about scale. Very often, actually, we get the question about scale. So can this be scaled up to change the current state of ecological destruction? Are there possibilities to create a broader movement, social movement, ecological movement through this practice, through practice of eco-commoning? And I think this is a real question, and this shows also how important scale is, but shows also the limits of scale. And the problem with scale is that scale is the reason and the cause of the situation we are now facing. Scale is a model of expansion, is a model of repeating a pattern and expanding the pattern outside of its ecological space. So you develop a pattern of production, for example, and you move it from one locale to the next and to the next and to the next. And by doing this, you erase ecological space, or you ignore it. And by erasing or ignoring it, you dominate it, and eventually you eliminate it. And this is also a model that comes directly through colonialism. So colonialism is the move that erases ecology. The colonialist doesn't have an ecology. It writes the ecology of others without having an ecology to be grounded in. It writes the colonial history through erasing ecology. So scale is a problem, and this understanding of scale and this practice of scale is transformed through productionism, which is again a way of negating ecological situatedness of how things are made and creating a pattern that dominates global spaces. So scale is the problem of distraction. But on the other hand, many of us feel, and I think this is an embodied feeling, this is a feeling of belonging to something that it goes beyond our local living niches, where we are embedded, where we act and where we move and connect. And this is the feeling that we need some sort of scale to encounter the problem we are facing. So scale is the problem, but at the same time, many people feel that scale needs to be part of a certain solution of this problem. And this is the paradoxical dimension of scale, and this is the paradox of solving and engaging with this complex dimension of environmental damage and environmental degradation that we are now part of. And eco-commoning comes as an engagement, at least for us, but I think for many people, because this is not a term or an idea that we invented or other people invented, but it is a practice, and it's a practice of movements. So we are borrowing here thinking and practices from actual experiments that take place already in many different locales on the ground. So eco-commoning is a way to engage with this paradox of scale. Thinking and knowing that we need to scale up, but knowing also that scaling up is a way of domination. So we need probably to scale out. We need to develop alternative ways. And eco-commoning is a way to think of such alternative ways and to develop intensive engagements in the localities in which certain groups of humans with other animals in certain ecologies are creating the ecological commons. Now I want to stop here and leave space for more discussion, but we can come back to this, how these intensive engagements take place and how this evolve and develop.
Thank you so much. I mean, it triggered a lot, at least in my imagination, especially thinking about scale in this context actually makes me think of like of performing or exercising some type of interscalability, not being fixed at a single scale, specifically if that scale is planetary, because planetary seems to be, you argue, global, and global is always imperial or colonial, which leaves speculation by side. So thank you so much. I hope that there will be time to extend this interesting discussion. But actually, your research and the problem that you're tackling with is somehow very nicely intertwined with the topic of research of Jennifer Gabrys. There are many touch points. I mean, the whole Swamp book is a rhizomatic terrain of these touch points. So right now I'm gonna turn it to Jennifer Gabrys and her experience and work with photosensors. So in your research, cultivation is one of the most important concepts. However, from etymological perspective, the word cultivation evokes, well, notion of soil, but also its preparation for planting, right? And not just planting, but that planting that is directed to the market, to commercialization, and actually productivism, extractionism, if you like. So you brought another term to this notion of cultivation. You brought this conjuring, idea of conjuring, which gives extraction or cultivation, for this matter, a certain cosmopolitical perspective. So can you clarify more on what do you mean by the notion of conjuring cultivation, and how swamp and swamping resonate with this concept?
Yes, thanks for that question, Nicola. I think this is something that I have been thinking about for a while, this question of cultivation and the directionality of who or what is cultivating and being cultivated. I think while the term certainly does have certain uses within practices such as agriculture and cultivating the land, that's part of what I'm attempting to invert in inhabiting this swamp manual of sorts and remaking it, transforming it into another set of practices. And I think here it's thinking about to what extent are humans the only cultivators? To what extent is cultivation something that is occurring across multiple entities? Since we could say that with the phytosensor toolkit, this involves partly tuning into the way that plants are cultivating air, they're conjuring pollutants out of the atmosphere and transforming them into other kinds of entities and relations. So I think here I wouldn't want to only have a singular sense of cultivation, although part of this is to think politically and practically about these existing practices of draining the swamp, but also to transform them through less directed, less production-oriented kinds of practices that assume that a human, a particular kind of human, a settler colonial human in many instances, or we've also heard in terms of fascism and so on, is making the land perform to certain productive logics. So I think here, as you rightly noted, cultivation and conjuring really are co-constitutive. They're working together to recast these relations between environments and subjects and to hopefully realize different kinds of political possibilities that are less extractive and more reciprocal.
Okay, thank you. So basically, what you, in a way, the idea of or concept of cultivation that you're trying to, well, invert or re-examine from the other perspective or from the other side, goes well with the notion of eco-commoning. If we try to, well, relate terms and concepts here. Don't you agree?
I mean, I think potentially they could speak to each other, but I wouldn't want to assume that the cultivation that I'm discussing in any way could kind of be synonymous for the richness of Maria and Dimitris's presentation. I mean, part of what I guess I'm trying to draw out, I've written about before in a piece on lichen sensing and how lichens are sensors of environments and how difficult it would be to cultivate a lichen garden. Lichens, mosses, these are organisms that often grow in mossy, swampy environments, but also evade a certain purposeful cultivation. So how is it possible to create these other kinds of gardens, these other kinds of spaces? I think here eco-commoning is raising this question in a different way. So I think there's certainly some points of connection there. But I also noticed that Victoria had something to say.
True.
No, it was a small thing. I was just going to add on to this this discussion of cultivate, of it being, just to say, I think it's a very rich term that includes so many different kinds of modalities. And so there is the kind of, colonial, like super agriculture, monoculture term, but also an earlier one, which is really just about inhabiting or tending or guarding, which is a kind of much less exploitative relationship. And so I think so many of these terms really contain multitudes and abilities to really take them in different directions, as Jennifer is doing in her work.
Okay, thank you so much both for this interaction, and actually this is nice transition to my next question, which is to you, Victoria. So in your contribution in the book, you brought interesting relations between Humboldt's research and Karl Albert Weber's research of Aukšte Mala swamp. Of course, I mean, people who I work with know that I have a crush on diagrams, maps, especially like historical things. So I'm very intrigued by this well-known, of course, Humboldt's section diagram, which actually in context of Karl Albert Weber and his Aukšte Mala, pioneering Aukšte Mala swamp study, is interesting because it points out to twofold characteristic of the swamp. And this twofold characteristic, according to your research, is that swamp is at the same time geological and geographic phenomenon. So can you clarify on this double-sided or even multiplicity of swamp phenomenon, and how this well, you call it a vertical intersection or vertical analysis of the swamp comes into play, especially today when geography is somehow very related to geology in the context of human shaping the new geological era.
Thank you so much for that question. So yes, there is a very important link between Alexander von Humboldt and Weber. Of course, von Humboldt really sets the kind of parameters for botanical research in the 19th century, and so Weber was enormously indebted to his earlier work. And I think with Humboldt's diagram, I mean, what we see is a larger 19th century phenomenon in which the section in general just becomes an incredibly important tool of analysis and representation. So it's not just happening in botany, it's happening in all kinds of fields, right? It's happening in kind of urban studies, it's happening, I mean, it's really happening everywhere. So that's a kind of quite interesting, I think, question of representation that one can locate historically. The other very important concept that Humboldt really contributes to Weber is this concept of vegetation, right? So he differentiates between individual plants and then this notion of vegetation, which is more of a kind of continuous surface or field that covers extents. And so this swamp is clearly an example of this vegetation where you have this large area of ground that is covered by this kind of mat. And it was in particular this type of kind of swampy, thick surface that is identified as this characteristic of Northern Europe. So there's a very clear identity between this particular geographical area and this kind of plant life. So those are two things that Weber gets directly. I mean, I think that my essay is trying to argue that he's taking these concepts, but he's really bringing them in a new direction by taking this representational device of the section and analyzing the swamp, and by doing so, inserting it into this kind of incredibly long duration of time. And so that's where this geological sense, right, this notion of deep time that comes from the study of geology is then merged with botany, and then kind of is the swamp becomes the exemplar of this. I don't know if I answered every part of your question, but
no, I mean this like vertical analysis or vertical sections that are, well, let's say like historical inventions like used and present for some time now in the context of Anthropocene can open up through swamp an idea of this thick layers, can open up maybe really a new ways of thinking about not just this interspecies relations and conviviality, but also our ways, human ways, like not non-human, but really human ways to understand this complexity. And understand our inability to understand this complexity, which I think is also very important. So thank you so much for this reflection. And in a way, you mentioned deep time, long duration, swamp as a long duration as it is, and I'm bringing up human time. which is not longue durée, fortunately or not. And this brings us to my last question in this particular series, which is a relation between human and this swamp complexity, between human duration and this swampian duration, between human body and the swampian body, and the wetlands body in a broader sense. So this question goes to you, Astrida. So you are writing about this complex relation between human and specifically even female body and body of a swamp, and trying to untangle this relation and somehow even as a contrasting, and two contrasting terms that are connected in many ways, in interesting and politically charged again ways. So from this interaction also comes up your idea of eco-sex, bad and good eco-sex, which of course sounds very provocative and theoretically very very interesting. So something definitely that I would like to hear more about.
Thanks for the question. So in this little chapter, what I'm trying to do is describe a feeling of being in relation to a place, which is perhaps a bit contradictory, because the place, as you might have heard in my little preview, you know, it's smelly and it's, you know, loud, and there's this industrial, you know, steel mill across the way, and a car wrecker's yard in the highway, and you can't go in the water, and it's littered with all sorts of pollution. And yet at the same time, there's a deep sense of sensuality and desire and love, just being sort of enveloped by these multi-species atmospheres in this place. And so in my chapter, I was trying to think through, you know, how can I come to understand this sense of like deep desire? And I was inspired by, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of, you know, Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens and their eco-sex movement, and sort of thinking through their idea of eco-sex. I was in conversation with a friend of mine, Lindsay Kelly, a few years ago, and she suggested, the term bad eco-sex kind of comes from her. She suggested, well, what if it was actually like we were having bad sex with the earth, you know? And sort of by thinking about bad sex, it's not like it's wrong or evil or immoral. It's just kind of like, maybe we're not quite at our best. Maybe it's a bit awkward. Maybe it's a bit damaged. Maybe we're bringing a lot of baggage with us. So I wanted to sort of play with that idea, to think about how we can still embrace a really authentic feeling of sensuality and desire in relation to places that still very much do hold the legacies, like in my case, of a deep colonial, damaged, violent past, of industrialization, of pollution, of all of these things that we can't just like make go away and somehow, you know, turn this place into, you know, a beautiful wetland again. But that doesn't mean that we still can't be in a real sensual and sexual relationship to this place. So that's the sort of idea I'm trying to play with there, and it's still developing.
Thank you so much for providing a sneak peek into this very interesting development. Personally, I'm very interested in where it's going to lead you, and probably some branch of a discourse that we are developing. It's very exciting, but also it brings up this brings up more idea of a body, even performative body, because sex is about is a performative action. So I'm not sure if anyone else has any question, or maybe John Jonas has something to add or reflect to this type of body environment, body ecosystem relations and exchanges, and how that resonate with your current thinking, or maybe even your recent works, specifically the one in Venice.
Well, thank you for asking. Can you hear me? Because I've been away.
Yes.
First of all, I want to apologize. I didn't read the last page of Gediminas and Nomeda's wonderful compilation of quotes from all of you. So I apologize for that. And
it's fine.
Maybe it was a sudden ending, but no, thank you for asking me. I'm not prepared for this, but I'll just say that I just did another project in relation to the ocean, which is my concentration in the world environment, and that was underground rivers. It's in the Biennale in Shanghai, and I'm very interested in the way. I mean, the idea of the swamp is really fascinating, and the peat bog. I just was recently reading about the peat bog, the people that were found, perfectly preserved in the peat bog in England, which is a very fantastical and apparently very beautiful. And so I can only say I've been to a bog in Cape Breton, which is on the top of a mountain surrounded by dead trees, and all dead trees. The foresters had come and cut all the trees down, but there was a bog there, and they're magical. It's a magical place, a bog, and the idea of this deep and big layer of matter that is on top of the bog, or is the bog, is I just would say very quickly, I'm absolutely not. I'm out of this discussion, but that would be a fascinating. For me, it would be an interesting path to follow. Would be to really look into the peat bog and how the peat bog functions and what's happening to it, in this present climate. Anyway, but thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Joan. It's actually a pleasure to hear your reflection, and I think it resonates well with the research and multi-year work, spatial work, material research that is done by our initiative at MIT, and it will be interesting to see how can develop maybe even with your ideas and engagements. I would now like to give maybe space for Christopas and his maybe final conclusion or reflection that will not synthesize but somehow unify the discussion that we have currently.
Thank you, Nicola. Actually, I had a question rather than synthesizing and providing the conclusion, but I would like to ask a question to Astrida, since I'm here to be the one who is really interested in this part of new imagination. And I had the pleasure reading your beautiful book, Bodies of Water, Posthuman Feminist Phenomenology. And I found it very inspiring to see the way you link the idea of figuration coming from feminist theories like Rossi Braidotti, and also linking it with Donna Haraway, with the idea of water, with water as such. And I thought that would be really maybe interesting to hear your reflection. How can this could be elaborated and brought into the context of the swamp? The swamp as the place or the key for the figuration. Do you think it makes sense for you in a way or the other?
Thank you for this impromptu question. Let me think quickly and say that I think definitely, like we've already heard in everybody's presentations today, that the swamp is a brilliant thing to think with. You know, it teaches us to think in the vertical dimension. It teaches us to think in deep time. It reminds us of things like cultivation and asks questions: who was cultivating whom or what? It's such an interesting figuration in that sense to think with. But, you know, when I draw on like Haraway and Braidotti to think about figurations, I'm also always, you know, in a feminist sense, concerned that a figuration doesn't just become an intellectual prop, you know, something that is instrumentalized to help us philosophers or scholars think big thoughts. But what would it mean to also think with something as, you know, invoking Maria's wonderful work as a matter of care and a matter of concern, so that to invoke the figuration of the swamp would also then be to ask, what can we give back to the swamp, and what can we do to care for swamps and peatlands and bogs that are very much endangered, you know, and not endangered not only for themselves, but, you know, bring the whole world along with them in their endangerment. So if we think of a figuration that way, as something that gives us something to think with, but then which also then asks of us something in return, then that would be a wonderful way to think about the swamp.
Thank you, Astrida, and also Christopas for the question. Do you have anything to add before I take in a question from Telegram? Okay, we're coming closer to the end, but there's still one really great question from Telegram, which also kind of reflects on our way of coming together right now here through the digital realm of Zoom. It's from O. Here she says, my question is concerned with internet and swamp. Perhaps it's fair to say that the global pandemic swampified human realities. It slowed them down. It brought biologic characteristics and microbial perspective to the front. It destabilized neoliberal regimes and modern habits of thought, etc. But everything would be absolutely different without the internet. As we see, it allowed otherwise unimagined regimes of operation by sustaining various vital functions of human society. So, how important is the internet for the swamp? Does it bring hope, or does it bring more problems than solutions? And I don't know who can take this, but I think it's super lovely. And maybe Nomeda Gediminas, maybe you want to say something about this? And don't forget to unmute yourselves.
Brilliant question. I think it's, yeah, absolutely concerns all of us. And as we are all, you know, swamped by the internet at the moment, but I just, you know, again, think through the figures of the and characters of our recent book, of the Swamp book. And what comes to my mind immediately is the contribution from Gloriana Davenport about Living Observatory, which is a beautiful project of regeneration of the cranberry fields into the swamp, back into the swamp. And it's all networks, is all connected to the internet through the enormous amount of sensors, maybe hundreds of sensors. So I think you should continue.
Perhaps 600 of sensors or more, and this is done as part of the research of returning this land back to pre-settler ecology. So this is, you know, kind of example of practice that is initiated by artists and then supported by scholars and engineers from MIT Media Lab. I think is not only done just primarily for the engineering purposes, you know, the data, but it is also for the engagement of artists and also people from other fields to engage what perhaps also Jennifer is doing in her work, the civic dimension of data.
Yeah, I really,
civic and artistic dimension.
Yeah, I really like this question also because it, what Astrida said, you know, the swamp is is such a powerful tool to think matters with. And I think if we start thinking the internet through the swamp, I think we might revolutionize media theory maybe. So that was kind of a nice new aspect there. And there was also another question right before from Barbara, but I think we kind of already tackled it because she asked as well, how do you see this extraordinary research might influence the formation of new earthly politics and collective actions? And I think we kind of tackled that already when Maria and Dimitris talked about you know, the commons and also the question of scale. And I just wanted to add that the Critical Zones exhibition, it proposes with Bruno Latour together the term of the terrestrial, also as a new vision of scale, which is not necessarily global and not necessarily only local, but takes both into consideration through understanding what soil, what ground we stand on. So I really appreciate this word. Yeah, so with this, I think we are really towards the end. Does anybody have like a last thought to share, something that has not been said yet, or something that we might take on in our minds after this lovely conversation? Is there any like last thought? And if there isn't, we should definitely quickly talk about the visuals behind each and every one of us, because they're amazing and we haven't mentioned who they're from and what context they're from. So that might also be a nice last thing to mention.
Okay. So the visuals are from the Swamp game, which is part of our contribution to the Critical Zones exhibition. And we developed it together with a Climate Visions lab, so to say. And you can still visit it on the ZKM's website, or Critical Zones website, actually, and try to be eaten. Follow the main rule of the metaphysics in the swamp.
And perhaps I will just add that the drawings actually are inspired by Carl Albert Weber drawings. So what you see in the backgrounds of today's speakers is design that is based on the Carl Albert's drawing from the book that Vittoria mentioned in her presentation, and this drawing is being hybridized with the algorithm. So you see this meandering line in the game changing and luring you into this in the world of the saturated colors and this and the chimeric shapes of so it brings you into the three-dimensional space of the Carl Albert Weber imagination.
Yeah, I really recommend visiting the Swamp game to everybody. I think it's the closest to bad eco-sex we will ever get. So I think Ada already posted the link in the Telegram chat, but you can also access it and find it on our ZKM website. So with this, I have the pleasure of closing this amazing, amazing session. Really, it's been, I think, the most populated terrestrial university we've had since the beginning. And I really want to thank each and every one of you for making the time and joining us in this digital swamp lounge. And I think you made all of us really fall in love with the incredible, unstable ground of the swamp. So thank you very much. And yeah, I would also like to thank the entire ZKM team, and especially the ones who are behind the scenes right now. So the video studio, who is the support for making this live stream happen. That's Tim, Andy, and Moritz. And there was also Peter who did the preparation. So thank you so much. And also my dear colleague Ada, who managed the entire communication. And there's also Daria and Jessica, who are part of the curatorial team behind Critical Zones. So thanks also to them. Yeah, see everybody at hopefully our next terrestrial university, which will take place on the 10th of June and which will explore Andean cosmologies together with Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. So yeah, hopefully see you then and have a lovely evening, everybody, and fall in love with swamps.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Vittoria, and thank you, Astrida, and Dimitris, and Maria, Nicola, Christopas, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara.
And thank you, Nomeda, Gediminas, and Christopas for the swamp imagination.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Wait.